Welcome, everyone, to the Elliott School of International Affairs in beautiful Washington, D.C., and to our series, Envisioning India. I'm James Foster, the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it, at the George Washington University, welcoming you to our conversation with Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah, entitled Diagnosing and Addressing India's Post-2011 Growth Slowdown, with discussion by Ashima Goyal and Devesh Kapur. Thank you for being here today. And to Dr. Kelkar, it's a special pleasure seeing you again after some time. I remember my late father-in-law, Dr. Besant Raj, speaking of you with great admiration from your days together at Administrative Staff College in Hyderabad. Mrs. Besant Raj is in fact here with us now and sends her kindest regards. Today I'm joined by my co-director, Jay Shambao, who will be moderating today's event. Jay recently returned to IIEP from a successful stint as the director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings, a return that was only slightly delayed by service on the Biden transition team. Jay, great to have you back.
Yes, I'm still in the same room in my basement, I guess, as I was doing the other things I've been doing lately. It's great to be back here with all of you. I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe a little more, when I was last director of IIEP, that we started a series on India when Ajay organized a great conference, our first conference on India's economy. And so it's been wonderful to watch what's happened with that series and with that work over the last 5 years. When I've been doing other things, and I'm thrilled to be back and be a part of it. And so I'll turn things back over to you and to Ajay to start things off, and I'll hop back in to moderate Q&A at the end.
Now, in just a moment, distinguished visiting scholar at IIEP, Ajay Chhibber, who organized the series, will set the stage and formally introduce our guests. But first, I would like to offer a word of thanks to our co-sponsor, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies in the Elliott School, whose director, Ben Hopkins, is a prominent historian of modern South Asia. And also to announce that another scholar of South Asia, Alyssa Ayres, will be joining GW as the new dean of the Elliott School. Now, for those of you who haven't attended a previous IIEP event, you can expect a nonpartisan, lively, and informative conversation on such topics as U.S.-China economic relations, urbanization and poverty, global economic governance, climate change, green finance, and digital trade. Our last Envisioning India episode featured Pranab Bardhan, Michael Walton, and Jean Drèze discussing India's distinct form of capitalism. In our China Conference series, David Michael Lampton and Deborah Lair recently had a conversation on the state of the U.S.-China relationship. Our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series resumes January 27th with Sir David Hendry and Dr. Jennifer Castle, with an amazingly clear and important presentation, Taking Stock of Climate Change, Earth, Air, Fire, and Water, with discussion by Anne Florini and Sunil Sharma. And on the 15th of February, Betsy Stevenson will discuss gender inequality in our Facing Inequality series. If you can't make an event synchronously, videos can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEP GW. Now, over to my distinguished colleague, Ajay Chhibber. Professor?
Thank you very much, James. Today it's a great pleasure to have a very, very distinguished set of speakers. But before I go there, may I mention as well that next month we will have a discussion on education, and we'll be joined by Rukmini Banerjee, the CEO of Pratham, the Asar Center, as well as Karthik Muralidharan will be speaking on education. But today we have a very thrilling session. We have Vijay Kelkar, who, in my mind, is that rare breed that you find in countries of a great policymaker, but also a great thinker. He has served in very high positions in government as Petroleum Secretary, Finance Secretary, Chairman of the Finance Commission. And for all these services, he was in service to the Republic, so to speak. He was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, which is one of India's highest awards. I always, some half-jokingly refer to him as the best finance minister India has never had. But there's always time for that still to come, so who knows. Joining him is Ajay Shah, who is a very distinguished expert in financial markets, in regulation, and I think he's written on almost any subject that you can think of in economics. He's also a professor at NIPFP, and a very distinguished record that he has. And we have also on the panel, we have Ashima Goyal. She is on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, the kind of position that Jay had in a previous administration here in the US. She's also a member of the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee, which sets interest rates and is now focused on inflation targeting. And the book that Vijay and Ajay have written has several references to the Monetary Policy Committee. So I'd be very interested in hearing her views, particularly on that, but on other subjects as well. And then we have a very distinguished professor at SAIS, Devesh Kapur. I first met Devesh when he was writing the history of the World Bank, a very comprehensive piece of work, but he's gone on to even bigger and better things, and he's written a lot on public institutions, role of the state, and he's now here in Washington, fortunately for us, at SAIS, and so it'd be great to hear from him. I do want to, before I turn it to Vijay, I do want to remind him that I organized a talk, a brilliant talk he gave in 2005, about 15 years ago at the World Bank, when India was growing at about 9%. And he, using this turn of phrase that he's so good at, he coined the phrase, the golden turnpike of growth that India was on. So that was 15 years ago, and how things have changed, and who better than him and Ajay Shah to now explain to us why the growth rate has gone sour. So over to you, Vijay and Ajay.
Well, let me first thank my good friends, Professor Foster and Professor Chhibber, for this very wonderful invitation to speak at PWU. I was just mentioning to Kyle that I used to see your great institution almost every day when I was in Washington, because I was supposed to work in your neighborhood, and always wanted to visit you, but somehow I didn't have the pleasure of doing it. But now, at least through web, I think I can have some participation with your wonderful university. Ajay mentioned about the lecture I gave. Actually, I started speaking the first time on that issue in year 2003 when I was invited to give a lecture in Austin National University. And I, that time, sort of thought about Indian growth prospects and essentially using the neoclassical framework of great Professor Solo, along with what I saw the demographic trends in India, plus what the factor productive growth rate possibilities. I've argued that India is now in a really sweet spot of sustained growth, what I call growth, turnpike growth, for at least next 2 to 3 decades. And indeed, I mean, India did grow between 2002 to 2012, that decade, roughly at around 8% or so. So there was it did happen. Not because I said so, but because many policies were propitious and conditions were propitious. But 2012 is somehow a break. I mean, if you want to take any breaking point, the fiscal year in India 12-13 was somehow where one can see distinct reversal of this continued growth. And since then, the growth has been sort of not as buoyant as we thought. And Ajay and I have started working together almost 20 years ago. I mean, he was my teacher for the last 20 years. We teach you on many things. And the issues which we have been sort of talking to each other on, first how to stimulate growth, and later on what happening, why growth is declined. So both sort of we have been discussing. And our discussion suggested to me and to him also that essentially the rapid decline in growth rate has been because of the series of deep policy errors, and also the unmet policy implementation challenges. In other words, we felt that we were getting wrong both in science and out of economic policy making. So that was really the motivation for working on this. And just to give examples of what was the great policy errors of last 10 years, we had 2 different regimes. First one was led by Dr. Manmohan Singh between 2004 to 2014, and 2014 onwards, it has been Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And before Dr. Manmohan Singh, it was the policy regime of Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But I think the first half of Dr. Manmohan Singh's regime, we did have a growth uptake and continued growth rate, essentially because of what was happened in the earlier era policy reforms. And but then the accumulated policy errors, and I think the one basic policy, or if you want to call political economy, the problem of that era was essentially the failure of hierarchy. The political system had 2 centers of power that time, and that really became very dysfunctional. And I'll come in a moment, which led to policy errors and which led to the growth deceleration. What was the major policy error? I think if you want me to name one which is a watershed, was 2012 budget of Mr. Mukherjee, when he introduced retrospective taxes on corporates. Retrospectively, he put a taxation. I mean, that is to my mind a defining moment of the policy errors. And then, of course, there are other errors, especially misallocation of natural resources such as spectrum allocation or in terms of coal allocation. And also, there are other similar kind of major policy errors. And on the arts side or implementation side, as I mentioned, the hierarchy, which had 2 policy centers in the government centers that completely disrupted coherent policy implementation, coherence in policy. So that was one sort of reason why there's a continuous decline in private investment, and which should have been a force of the growth generation. Unfortunately, these policy errors continued by the new government over the last 6 years. And there are major policy errors. I mean, if one wants to, let me first also mention, is to be fair to the government of Dr. Manmohan Singh, there were many other important changes were brought about indeed. And I would not say everything was sort of negative, but negatives overpowered the positives in terms of acceleration of private investments and private. Now, what were the major policy shocks, errors of the government which came into power in 2014. I think one was classic, the demonetization, which was bad science and bad and worse art in terms of policy making. Second, the faulty implementation of GST. The GST was not bad science, but certainly the way it was done was completely bad art. I'm talking art and science. The second bad science is complete reversal of trade liberalization policy by increasing very, very arbitrary changes in import duties and import policies. And finally, I mean, just to give you examples, currently we're facing another grave policy error in terms of, again, example of perhaps good science, but certainly bad art, is the farm laws. The way entire North India is now come to standstill in terms of the farmers' agitation. So I think, again, these are the reason why what led to sort of persuaded me and Ajay that perhaps time has come to write something about how policies should be sort of policy making can be improved. And this book, I mean, our target group for this book was essentially the policy making community, opinion makers, and students and teachers of economic policies. And our aim and objective is really to help our country to emerge as a mature and dynamic market economy within the strengthened liberal political framework. And that is the objective of the my policy. I just now made 2 or 3 only additional remarks, and then I'll give floor to. You see, myself, Ajay, decided to do a label in our presentation. I told you I do the difficult part and he'll do the easy part. So let me finish the more difficult part now. Is even between this distinguished group, what we call science, you will find it very elementary for this distinguished group, the economic science, what we cover in our book. But believe you me, at least our experience in the last decades has shown that these concepts are still not being. How many times I have to explain to the ministers and the senior civil servants that the market economy, government can't fix both price and the quantity. I mean, they're very, very elementary concepts, so we had to sort of simple but obvious concept to many of our people in this audience, but still was important to mention. So we give a lot of emphasis on science part of it because it's important to understand that there's certain important scientific elements. But I think the most interesting part of our book, I believe, is our section on art of policy making, and it's based on learnings which me and Ajay had while working in the government. Also, our understanding of literature on what the rest of the world focused on essentially the state capacity as the strategic variable which explains around which the art of policy making revolves. And we have drawn upon the insights from public choice theory and also the other recent work of many scholars, including our good friend Devesh Kapur's work on institution and institutional economics. So these are 2 areas. So I'll stop at that. And now, if you permit, Mr. Chairman, I'll request Ajay Shah to continue. Ajay, to
you. As Dr. Kelkar said, growth in India has palpably slowed down. I'm reminded of Robert Solow on the computer revolution. The computer revolution is everywhere except the GDP data. Well, in similar fashion, the Indian growth slowdown is everywhere except in the GDP data. And when there is a slowdown in investment, it goes with a stagnation in the number of persons employed. And let's look at some facts. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, so this is one very important macroeconomic fact about India. This is the investment of all the non-financial firms. So this is some a data set of about 20,000 non-financial firms. And the value that is shown in the graph is the year-on-year growth of the net fixed assets, which is an interesting proxy of corporate fixed investment. And what we see is that there was one boom which ended in 1996. There was one boom which ended in something like 2007. And we're standing in 2020, 13 years later. And net fixed assets growth is at sub 10% levels, which are amongst the lowest levels in Indian history. They are comparable to the values that you saw right before the 1991 crisis, at the lowest point of 2001, 2002, and at the lowest point of 2003, 2004. Okay, could you go to the next slide? Yeah, the next way to think about private investment is to look at the stock of investment projects that are presently actually under implementation. This is a levels time series expressed in rupees trillion in 2020 rupees. So it's not nominal, it's real. And what we see is that there was a dramatic surge from about 2003 to about 2011. And from 2011 till today, there's been quite a decline. We've gone from values of about 85 trillion rupees to values of about 36 trillion rupees. So there's really quite an investment bust. And I could link this up to the labor market data. And roughly speaking, what we see is that in the last 5 years, the number of persons employed has been about flat, while the number of people in the working age has gone up. And this goes hand in hand because almost all jobs are in the private sector, and the investment of private corporations is a decent proxy for the economic dynamism of the private sector. Could you go to the next slide? So this is the great question of the age. Kelkar and I once thought that Mark II economic policy strategy, which is what India figured out after the socialism of the 60s, we used to think that that was our ticket to becoming an OECD country in 20, 30 years, but that didn't work out. Why did private investment change dramatically in around 2011, 2012? We think of this as the most important question in Indian economics today. Compared to this, almost every other question just pales. And we were deep in the policy process in the turnaround of the things that happened 2002 to 2005. And we have watched with dismay as this period petered out from around 2011 onwards. And we felt it was time to write a book. Could you go to the next slide? Now, all across India, there is a reasonably difficult scene in the environment of public policy. So whether you think about the courts or the police, or you think about climate change, or you think about renewable energy, you look at monetary policy or the criminal justice system or financial regulation or what have you, every piece of the Indian state works reasonably badly. In the book, we describe how there's been a rough doubling of the per pupil expenses in government schools, and the learning outcomes have actually become worse. Similarly, the immunization coverage of kids has actually declined in the last 20 years, and so on. So there's a large-scale failure of the Indian state all across the place. So Occam's razor demands that we should look for parsimonious explanations that are cross-cutting. So it's not an accident that something went wrong in one field and we're getting bad outcomes. It's not that there was just some unlucky political economy in the field of agriculture. It's not just that we had some bad decisions in the field of electricity. When there is failure upon failure upon failure running all across the landscape, Occam's razor demands that we've got to think in a more cross-cutting way. So a large number of public policy books in India tend to write one chapter about one sector at a time. So the typical machinery of a public policy book in India is there'll be one chapter on finance, one chapter on fiscal policy, one chapter on monetary economics, one chapter on energy, and so on. But we thought that that's no longer a very useful way to approach it because something deeper has broken. So we think of this book as a general technology of public economics, of law and public administration that cuts across all fields. So inside the book, there are 59 short examples, which are from all across the landscape in terms of the fields that they touch upon. The chapters are entirely non-sectoral. So the chapters are about a general technology. They are not about one sector at the time. And only at the end, we do 4 demos of using this intellectual framework to work on 4 sectors. So we have 4 sectors. They are health, they are finance, they are macrofinance crises, and the GST. So we do these 4 as demos of how to use this intellectual framework and figure out one sector at a time. But the book is not a collection of sectoral papers. It's a general technology of how to think about what is going wrong in Indian public policy. Could you go to the next slide? So it's organized as 7 parts. In part 1, we pose the foundations of the difficulties of trying to build a state and achieve state capacity. In part 2, we go closer to the difficulties that we have had in India, about the failures of various aspects of Indian public policy. Then in part 3, we have a group of chapters that we call the science. When we say science, we mean the areas where there is really a lot of clarity and plenty of evidence, and most of us would be able to persuade each other that on this question, this is the answer. Then in part 4, we go on to what we call the art, which is the really difficult areas where it is not possible to be certain. There are very important questions. We think all of us will benefit from asking those questions, and we have some opinions and some ideas for what we think is going on, but it's perfectly reasonable for readers to diverge from that point of view. These are open areas of scrutiny. Then in part 5, we go closer to the public policy process and get into some of the gritty of how the machinery of government works and where the machinery flounders and how to work more effectively. This is closer to law and public administration. It's about the nuts and bolts. It's about the things that are going wrong in India. Then in part 6, as I said, there are 4 sectoral chapters where we apply the machinery of part 3, 4, 5 in adding value in one sector at a time. So we have 1 chapter on health, 1 chapter on finance, 1 chapter on macro financial crises, and 1 chapter on the GST. Some of you will recognize these are all areas that Kelkar and I have worked on for many years, but we treat them as demos rather than as the substantive content of the book. They are showing the beauty and the effectiveness of the machinery of the book, that it can actually be applied to all kinds of fields. And finally, we have some parting words where we look back a little into the history of ideas and action in India, and I'll come to that in a moment. Could you go to the next slide? So our big idea of understanding the growth slowdown, the difficulties of private investment from 2012, is that we in India today have a central planning problem and a rule of law problem. The central planning problem is that there is state intervention that is excessive and inappropriate. The state is all over the landscape. The state is picking winners. The state is picking firms, is picking technologies, is picking how the machinery of the market economy works. And the interventions of the state are going way beyond addressing market failure. Even today, the Indian state is building public sector monopolies, is shutting off the ability of private firms to operate in certain sectors, is prescribing technologies. You may have thought that used to happen in the bad old days of the 60s and 70s. It is alive and well today. So there is a whole lot of central planning that is alive and well in India today, and we're far from done from some of the basics of understanding market failure and state intervention. And the second big problem is rule of law. How rules are applied in India depends on the person in question. And all this has added up to a great deal of risk for private persons. For a private person, there is a risk that policy can change. And policy changes happen in a way that is unpredictable and is influenced by special interests. So for any one person, there is business model risk because you don't know whether your business will be disrupted because critical elements of the policy landscape are going to change. And there is risk that coercive power will be used against any one person, and it adds up to a risk of expropriation. So it has created an uncomfortable environment, and a lot of private persons are nervous, and that explains the collapse of investment. So Dr. Kelkar just talked about retrospective taxation as an example. It is one element, and there are many, many similar elements that the coercive power of the Indian state today is wielded in unpredictable ways that has created fear in the eyes of private persons. and that is the source of the decline in private investment. And to change these things, we've got to go to the foundations. We've got to change the foundations of law and public administration so that we remove the ability of the Indian state to engage in this kind of central planning and to claw back rule of law so that there is predictability and equal treatment in the way coercive power is wielded. Would you go to the next slide? We find it very useful to look at the great sweep of the Indian experience in the terms Mark 1 and Mark 2 and Mark 3. Mark 1 is the economic policy framework, which was built by the Indian National Congress and its community, roughly speaking, from the time Gokhale handed over the Congress to Gandhiji and Nehru in about 1920. So from 1920 to 1947, lots of people thought about what they were going to do when India became free. And this stuff was rolled out from about 1947 onwards. And it generated an increase in growth rates in India from about 1950 to 1962. These growth rates were higher than anything seen under colonial rule. And then lots of things started going wrong. Mark 2 is the machinery that was figured out by people like Arun Shuri, Manmohan Singh, Jagdish Bhagwati, T.N. Srinivasan, Ashok Desai, Montek Ahluwalia, and others. This was figured out in the period roughly from 1960 to 1991. The implementation of this machinery began when the Janata Party took charge in 1977, fairly rapidly generated an impact on GDP growth from 79 and worked in full bloom in the growth and investment episode of 1991 to 2011. And Mark 3 is the present predicament. And we feel that all of us in this room need to apply our minds to figuring out what is the nature of the Indian state, what is the idea of India that we need to put together to lay the foundations for a complex market-led economy. And one by one, a lot of us have started thinking about this after the investment collapse began in 2012, and we don't know when it will be rolled out, but this is the grand question of the age, and our book is our contribution towards thinking about Mark 3. Could you go to the next slide? So I'm at the end of this slideshow, and on that URL, we have collected together a whole bunch of book reviews and numerous podcasts. We've been interviewed by all the Indian economics podcasts and many video interviews and so on. So some of you might find this interesting. Okay, I'm at the end of this show, and now we should turn to back to Ajay Chhibber, who will manage the program.
I think Jay is chairing, right? Jay will manage. Jay?
Sure, yes, thanks. So I think next up we're going to Ashima Goyal to be the first discussant, and then after that we'll move to Devesh Kapur.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Ajay, for the invitation, and Ajay for excellent Ajay and Vijay for excellent presentation. I particularly liked the invite because I hadn't read the book, and it was an opportunity to read it, which I enjoyed. An excellent approach to begin with principles and emphasize both the science and art of policy making and the moderation required in practice, practical details, rich experience of policy making. I heartily agree with conclusions such as necessity of building up data sets, of dialogue across different sections, of expertise, of improving the institutions of government. But since our big question is the slowdown after 2011-12, I think that the explanation of a decay in institutions is not adequate to explain the fall in the rate of growth, since actually much of the governance institutions were worse before 2011. And after that, we have had some reforms that have actually improved, such as the abolition of the Planning Commission, etc., RERA, IBC, and other improvement in infrastructure, DBT, Aadhaar, a lot of changes. So the alternative causes of growth decline that I would flag is overreaction in monetary and macroeconomic policy after the post-global financial crisis, where we had overstimulus as part of the global effort. So both macro as well as regulatory policies were pro-cyclical, all tightening together and too much since 2011. And moreover, the thinking was such, this thing on institution building, the focus was totally on structural reform and macroeconomic stabilization was totally ignored. We all know that some reforms impose large costs. Vijay has highlighted policy mistakes. So recently we are seeing farm laws, that there's a huge political pushback if there are attempts at real reform that affect large groups of people. So what happened before 2011 was the financial markets haven't developed as expected, bond market. So infrastructure lending, during the boom, PSPs were pushed to lend, there were external shocks. And since for the first time, private sector was involved in infrastructure building, there were fears of corruption, which led to regulatory tightening. And public sector banks could not be recapitalized until the IBC was enacted, which happened in 2016. Then promoters could actually lose assets and any recapitalization money would not go to them. But the asset quality review was imposed in 2014. Credit growth slowed in India while it was booming in the rest of the world. At that time, I was in the technical advisory committee of the Reserve Bank. And so we started implementing inflation targeting. And we switched from negative real interest to really high positive rates of interest. The rest of the world had QE and interest rates at the zero bound after the global financial crisis. And moreover, our own domestic inflation fell with the oil price crash in 2014, but rates were not lowered adequately. So while in this book, Ajay and Vijay discuss that you need to adjust principles to context. But I think inflation targeting was not, actually the deal signed was flexible inflation targeting, but what was implemented was strict. And when you have high debt and high real rates, that's a recipe for corporate distress. And then there was distress in the system in IL and FS collapse. There were governance problems also. There was no lender of last resort liquidity provision. So there was typical systemic spillovers that you would expect, risk aversion, non-bank financial companies stopped, just were not able to roll over their short-term debt they'd taken earlier, and they just stopped lending. Already credit growth in India through this decade was much lower. It was among the lowest in the world. And after this, credit growth in H1 2019-20 was only 12% of that in H1 2018-19. How can any economy grow under such conditions? And then the second big factor responsible for the slowdown in growth was really, it was emerging markets as a whole that grew more slowly after 2011, not just India. And this was because they had to deal with surges of capital flows due to QE and global risk on and risk off, not due to their own policies. So we should not blame ourselves too much. For example, in India in 2013, the US tapered on. And in 2018, the rise in Fed rates led to large outflows and domestic interest rates, real interest rate was raised, although there was a domestic slowdown. And the rupee was appreciating, hurting our exports. So I would urge the authors towards a little more balance when they say that Indian government and regulatory capacity is low and they advocate total hands-off. But they should also notice that there was a lot of private sector rule breaking. Anti-corruption movement began in India as private wealth grew with growth and natural resources became privatized. There was the Anna Hazare movement in 11-12. So when they advocate legal oversight over regulators, I agree that regulation has also tightened pro-cyclically and created problems. So the answer is prudential regulation with good incentives, which reduces discretion, limits discretion of regulators. So no super regulator, but sharing of information. And here I think there are very positive things happening where firms, there's a conscious flagging of reduction in compliance costs with multiple regulators. So sharing information in one global database, which all regulators can dip into, etc., things like that. Then the other factor, which I think is book neglect, is the role of federal constraints. Vijay has done some excellent, as a finance commission chair, but excellent work in this. But center-state coordination is a big problem. There are multiple regulations that firms have to face. And then central planning was imposed on an inherited centralized colonial structure in India. So that is why the initial GST, today, they discuss this in a chapter, was not simple, because getting states on board, you had to do all sorts of compromises. But then there is continuous meeting and negotiation working towards simplicity. So Ajay Chhibber asked me to focus more on macroeconomics. So I think that there are growth drivers today in India. And this comes from, over looseness after the GFC, over tightness through this decade, now moving towards more balance and better coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. So there's actually evidence for this. For example, like Ajay Shah was saying, that that you don't see the growth slowdown in the GDP, but you do. And the media has been sort of blowing this up, that India was already slowing before COVID hit. But, when you look at, because the liquidity tightness, the turnaround was in July 2019 with a new regime. And by February 2020, you saw a reversal. In high frequency data, you were seeing growth was rising. And then COVID hit in March. So for the year as a whole, the rate of growth was only 4.2%. It looked as if growth has been falling every single year. Now, after COVID hit, you saw same thing, because the Reserve Bank, really a lot of innovative policy, there's a better coordination, there was risk aversion because of this history of firms going under financial distress, NBFCs in trouble. So the government credit warranty helped RBI liquidity provision work. If you talk to people on the ground, they would say they've never seen the economy like this. There's no money, nobody has money, everybody is just sitting on it, in 2019 and then 20. So now slowly you started liquidity going in and people starting to spend. So among analysts, it's a huge puzzle that why is the Indian recovery faster than expected? So apart from not having a second peak in COVID itself, it's better because of this liquidity, and because while the West was going through this QE through all the decade of the 2010s, we had very tight financial conditions. We had enough reforms. Some of the reforms are essential. So, for example, banks are now doing risk-based lending. The moratorium was given for a temporary period. So that's the balance I'm talking about. It's not over-stimulus like after the GFC. The media has been pushing the government to spend more, but looking at our fiscal condition, the spending has been calibrated and largely through these sort of liquidity provisions, etc., or things that are off balance sheet, and which have reversal built in, so good incentive properties. Banks are saying that collection efficiency is very good. They don't see huge NPAs forming, because there's also a faster recovery. And at the same time, they're continuing focus on reforms to improve the supply side, reduce cost of doing business, to move to WTO compliant forms of subsidization, because now we've reached a per capita income level, we can no longer distort prices, which is a source of huge increase in costs and distortion in the Indian economy. So direct Aadhaar and these DBTs, direct subsidies. And that is why one of the really nice things here is that all along private banks were just lending to retail and public sector banks were lending to firms. But today, HDFC has the fastest rate of growth of lending to SMEs because the government is giving a warranty. So the government is picking up the subsidy tap, not the banks. So private banks are also doing this. This is and even regulatory balance, like there was over strictness. Many of those bankers were investigated, the 3 Cs, and put under bars and so on. But now the Company Act has been amended to remove provisions for criminal penalties. The PCA, Corruption Act for public officials, has been amended so that a public official can be investigated only if there's actual evidence of disproportionate assets. So you're moderating. I mean, I don't think you can't say we haven't learned anything, or maybe there was policy overreaction, but we are coming towards more balance. States, GST experience has led to better dialogue and coordination between the center and state. And they're now coordinating to reduce logistics costs, which is can be a tremendous source of reduction in regulatory and compliance costs because of these overlapping regulations being reduced. So I would say to Vijay and Ajay that don't compare us to the kind of invisible infrastructure that supports policy in, say, US and UK, but look at East Asia and what those governments were able to do to improve, to deliver a development transition. They followed very pragmatic, non-ideological policy that sometimes they actually used industrial policy. In a way, I think in India, we had too much import competition from China where costs of doing business were high in India. So you need some adjustment there. This production-linked incentive scheme, working on the diversification of global supply chains away from China to attract some of that to India and so on. And finally, I would say that the promise of India's constitution for equitable human development was hijacked by the planning process. There are major externalities here. The government has to, given our poverty and congestion, the government has to deliver here. And now there is a push from the electorate, from handouts and subsidies towards education and better air quality, etc. And I would not say that our governance capacity is so poor. When you look at India's experience with COVID-19, that we managed to avoid a peak such as happened in the West and in our neighboring countries. I think our staggered unlocks, so the lockdown was very severe and imposed large economic costs, but the staggered unlocks and then have helped business revive while containing the spread of the disease. They point towards administrative capability, precautions taken, medical preparedness. So while the US has been fighting to save its democracy in past couple of months, we've all been watching and learning. But in India, I remember I once reviewed a book by Ramchandra Guha, India After Gandhi. He was talking of how at independence, because we had universal, vote franchise, which is very rare. And these were illiterate people. And, the Western press was full of Indian democracy cannot last. Illiterate hordes invading the hallowed halls of parliament. But our democracy has taken deep roots. We are seeing that if the government tries, like the CAA, and you saw the young people rising and saying, no, they really believe in secular values, they don't want discrimination. So I think democracy has very deep roots in India, and our institutions are slowly improving. They cannot be subverted that easily. And as we better balance between reforms and counter-cyclical macro regulation, we're hopefully going to do better. But we need some help from the world in from global institutions and how to deal with these emerging markets as a whole. Again, with COVID, we're seeing QE, and India has had a huge 100 billion rise in its reserves, huge inflows because of QE. While our government cannot borrow and spend for universal protection, governments in the West are doing that, and we are facing the consequences. So let's not blame ourselves all the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think now we're going to turn to Devesh Kapur for the second round of discussant comments. And then after that, we'll also, don't forget, have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A function or put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring both and bringing those back to the group later.
So first, I want to congratulate Vijay and Ajay. They have been my teachers in so many ways, and they have written this book in their characteristically lucid style, which has been a hallmark of their writings. Now, a key argument of the book is that despite the liberalizing thrust of the 91 reforms, the Indian state has not rolled back, it has just rolled over. It continues to be much more interventionist. then it should be as per basic economic principles, and even more so given its limited capabilities. If anything, there is an increasing trend to a top-down, non-deliberative approach, and the results, the authors argue, are patently manifest. I broadly agree with this argument. I just want to raise a few points to sort of now, the book's core argument of a more interventionist Indian state focuses on the supply side, namely what the Indian state does and how much it does. But the reality is, I think that to a considerable degree, it is a response also like to a demand side, sort of writ large. Everyone in India, bar a small minority, including the authors, wants the Indian state like to do more. Statism is not just in the DNA of India's political and bureaucratic class. It's in the DNA of Indian society. And also, and I'll come to this later, which the authors sort of ignore, it's also very much in the DNA of India's intellectual class. Second, if you accept the proposition that statism is very deeply embedded in India, the larger puzzle is not why the Indian state intervenes as much as it does, but rather, given the degree to which it does intervene, why has it not sought to build a commensurate state capabilities? The Indian state is one of the smallest states by size on per capita basis. If you compare the Indian state with the US, in the US, at least one of its two major political parties does not believe in the state. In India, every political party believes in the state. And yet the Indian state per capita is less than half the size of the state in the United States. Not only is it small, it has very large number of vacancies in every part of the government machinery. From the office of the BDO at the micro level, vacancies are 25 to 40%, to the regulators, to faculty in IITs, you name it, to judges, police, every part of the state machinery has large numbers of vacancies. And third, its structures and systems have been largely unchanged since British India. And the question is, why? Now, you could argue that to some degree, the weakness of state capacity is endogenous to political economy. Politicians might want to have a weak police, weak courts. You keep them deliberately weak so that the demand for politicians to intervene, to adjudicate, to mediate is greater. If after all the systems work all fine, why should anyone go and ask a politician like for a favor, and there will not be any quid pro quos? But it's also been weak, quotes, because of the legal profession. The governance of the Bar Council of India makes the governance of the Indian legal ministry look actually pretty good. We have to understand that the weakness of many of the weaknesses the authors discuss in the book is not just about the state. It is a broader weakness, for instance, the weakness of the governance of India's professions. That's a weakness of Indian civil society. It's a weakness of India's private sector. Much of that part, I feel that the book really sort of elided over. Now, the other thing I think that's interesting to ask is that why is this, I mean, the book's focus is largely at the central government, but many of the features that it highlights are ubiquitous across India's states. India is a federal system. So to take an example that the book highlights about policy making, that in Indian higher education, the focus has been increasingly on STEM fields, and the humanities and the social sciences are much weaker. And that sort of means that the sort of human capital needed for these broad policy debates and discussions are also weaker. I think that's an excellent point. But the question to ask is, the higher education in India is on the concurrent list. Why has no Indian state built a university, has spent money, resources over the past 70 years that can stand out? Take West Bengal. It is a state that has produced more economists that work in universities around the world than any other state in India. It has produced 2 Nobel laureates in economics. And yet, is there any economics department in the state of West Bengal that the authors feel that they could go to for any policy advice on anything? And the answer is unlikely like to be yes. And the question is why? The 6th point I want to raise is, when the authors' approach to political economy is very much driven and grounded in a public choice approach that has the advantage of a very clear-headed, sort of logic. But again, when we see what's been happening in the world in the past, at least this past decade, it's not public choice, I think, where most of the answers lie. It's more and more in political psychology. The book has not a single word on caste or religion. The politics of caste and religion in India, what we call, sort of mandal and mandir. We saw how a country like the US, with all the strengths the authors highlight, how its politics was reshaped by the politics of identity. That 70 million people voted for a president on whom there were no information asymmetries. How does public choice really explain that? One has to now think much more of the politics of identity, and in political psychology, to understand some of the deeper political trends that we are sort of witnessing. The book, I think, is rightfully very skeptical of industrial policy, but I want to add a caveat. I don't think so. In some cases, it is a matter of choice. If you look at 5G, the book was written prior to the big sort of Himalayan standoff with China. India will have to make a choice on technologies. Those choices have severe implications for India's security. And therefore, it is not a matter of choice. It has to be done. It is not that India should not have industrial policy because its capabilities are weak. But in some cases, it has to build its state capabilities because it has to choose between competing standards in technologies which have larger geopolitical implications and implications for India's security. I'll end with a last comment. It's very common when I go to these sort of discussions that we lay full blame on at least in India's case, on the politicians and the bureaucracy. And there is much blame to go around there. But I want to push the authors to ask hard questions about India's intellectuals and Indian intellectuals worldwide. If you look at current debates on agriculture policies, as Vijay very rightly pointed out, this government has made a real mess in how it has implemented it. But the policies per se were ones that by the logic of the book on economic principles were not wrong. Yet, many of the people, the same economists who were very much for these policies earlier, are very much opposed to these policies now, because, of course, there are considerable ideological proclivities. Economists also are driven by ideologies. They are not just driven by the cold logic of fact. It is something I think the authors pointed out about all the people in Mark I who created the intellectual framework for what happened subsequently. But compared to them, there were a very large number of India's economists also, and intellectuals, who were for that type of statist policy making. Just as there are now many economists who would support certain types of policies based on ideologies, rather than necessarily what the economic principles and logic that this book so cogently lays out. I think we should ask some hard questions and look into the mirror ourselves of what intellectuals have done about where India's economic policies have gone, and not just about what politicians and the bureaucracy has done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both those sets of comments. I think they were great. And so before we turn to the Q&A that have come from the audience, there are many good questions. I wanted to give the authors a quick chance to respond to the discussants, and maybe just to focus that if you think of Ashima's terrific discussion, really focusing in many ways on this idea of, can you think about a real shift in macroeconomic trajectory, whether it's in growth or especially in investment, as coming from a fast pivot in institutions, or does it seem more to be tied in with, or at least somewhat more than the book says, tied in with macroeconomic policy shifts? And so how do we think about that? And then with Devesh's comments, I think, especially if you could maybe just address pulling back quite a bit further, the question of, should we focus entirely on the choices of the current group of policymakers, or think more about the statist tendencies that you see more broadly in India, whether it's in the populace or in the intellectual class, and how much is that driving some of the things you're concerned with? So if maybe you could quickly talk through those types of ideas, or anything else that you really thought was important to address from the discussants, and then I'll bring some of the questions out of the chat. I don't know who wants to go first, Vijay or Ajay. I'll leave that to you.
Thanks a lot, Ashima and Devesh. Those are very interesting comments and responses. I would just like to quickly present two thoughts in response. So Ashima, on the alternative explanations involving macro policy, the problem is that the time series are remorseless. So when you look at the investment of private firms, either as seen in the balance sheet data or as seen in the projects data, it's just remorselessly gotten worse. And the phenomena that you describe should have generated some blips along the way, and they haven't. So I feel you've got to go look for deeper explanations. So that is why we started moving away from practical everyday stories around macro and finance to something deeper. There's something worse that's going on that we need to grapple with. Devesh, we agree with you 100%. This statism is everywhere. It is in the intellectual class. It is in every thinker about economics and development in India. It is the mainstream view of every economist in India. And that is why we wrote this book. So the idea of this book is to create a little more argument and debate between all of us, and to take us 3 steps back from where we have come, because where we have come is a truly unpleasant place. And it's interesting and important to think about the words decline in state capacity. I think you were there when Pratap and I were having this big disagreement on the subject at CPR some time ago. I think it's very easy for all of us to think that in India, the GDP got bigger, the people are obviously richer, the firms have amassed enormous organizational capacity. A sophisticated firm in India looks really good, either when compared against 20 years ago or when compared against a global firm. And I think that masks the difficulties that have been influencing the state structures. So if you think of objective metrics of the capabilities of the police or of the courts or of the parliament or of the debates that happened around the finance bill, it's hard to avoid the idea that over the last 20, 30 years, state capacity has actually declined. I think you had a better crack at drafting a decent PPP contract 20 years ago than we have today, and so on. So the state capacity constraints have gotten worse, and the mechanical application of the same old statism is giving worse results than it used to. So I think it's this mixture of wanting to argue more explicitly that we don't have the ability to implement the aspirations of the old style Indian statism, and there is a great deal to question about the old style Indian statism. This is the essence of what we're trying to do in this book. It's very much a book for the people in this room. It's not intended as a book that will be consumed by a much larger audience. It's a book for the conversations between all of us.
Mr. Chairman, can I add one point?
Yes, please.
This is to sort of mention, to emphasize the point made by Devesh. The problem of state capacity is even more salient or intense when you go to subnational level. And if you look at the whole supply of public goods, you will find repeated problems of state capacity in thinking about designing it and also implementing it. So, but you're absolutely right. We not discussed the subnational level, the issues, but the issue of state capacity is even more relevant on the subnational level.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring now some of the questions from the Q&A, and I'll kind of direct them initially to the authors, but if either of the discussants want to weigh in, please just, I can see you, so just kind of raise your hands and I'll call on you too. So the first one, I think I could sum up as asking in some sense, do you blame the polity or the bureaucracy here? So is it a problem of the political leaders who have been there recently, or is it a broader problem of the bureaucracy, especially in the context of your response here, where you talked about a decline in state capacity over 20 or 30 years? That's less of a sharp break in the policymakers and more of a long-term trend. And so do you view it as an issue of bureaucracy or kind of choices being made by policymakers in the immediate sense?
I think it is a much wider failure of, I would argue, a failure of the elite failure. In terms of, as Devesh said, even among intellectuals, there is a complete, I think, inadequate understanding of what really challenges are. I'll give a simple example. The current problem which we're facing on farm laws, which is really the most remarkable agitation going on. I think one of the sources, because of our economists like me, who were telling this government that, parroting this line, that crisis is the best time to have reforms. Now, if reforms have no relation with the crisis, source of crisis, you're in trouble. Indian crisis today was because of farm, but because of public health, which is COVID. So you can't use at that time and start to the whole conceptual framework also of many of our thinkers, social policy or social scientists has been also responsible. So just widespread malaise, not just politicians. I would not just argue politicians, because you see repeatedly arguments were made by even people living in the United States. Many economists were advising the government, crisis is the best time to reform. So there has been a widespread failure, in my view, of not really understanding how policies are made, successful policies are made in democratic societies. It is a widespread failure.
Yes, Devesh, you want to talk in?
So my one slight disagreement with Ajay is, I don't agree that state capacity in India has declined unequivocally. It has declined in some areas, but it has undoubtedly improved in other areas. To take two examples, which you have the state capacity in the police has not declined. It has increased. We are doing a large project on internal security in India. Every indicator of violence, the homicide rate today in India is 40% less than it was in 1990. Riots, strikes, terrorism, assassinations, all of these are much less than they were in the 80s and 90s. On the other hand, the law ministry, as you very rightly said, it doesn't have the talent to draft a proper PPP. So we find in work we are doing at the micro level in India's districts, whether you look at the office of the BDO, whether you look at the office of the Tehsildar on land, state capacity has undoubtedly been improving. There were no halcyon days in the past in state capacity at the local level.
Yeah, I'm not at all suggesting that there was any golden age in state capacity. I just want to say that it's a great thing that we're having this conversation, and I'm very happy to get into details separately with you. Would love to sit with you and talk further. But right now, I'm only going after the simple notion on our minds. All of us have been part of this idea that it is integral to going from a $300 billion GDP to a $3 trillion GDP, that there should have been a comprehensive transformation of the capabilities of state institutions. We tend to take it for granted. We see a sophisticated Indian private firm today, and we see something amazing has happened, and we tend to jump to the conclusion that comparable advances have happened in all modern complex organizations in India. And I just want to say, not necessarily.
Ashima.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to respond to Ajay's point that there's a continuous decline in investment. That is not true, because there was a recovery, say 2015, and again in February last year, in early February. And then again, now we are seeing that imports are rising, and imports of intermediate goods, of capital goods, of metals, and so on. So firms take some time to respond and increase investment. And also, you can't see that immediately. And I think we make a mistake when we look at investment to compare to what was happening in the 2000s, where there was a huge infrastructure from the part of private parties. So you won't see that kind of investment abound. But we have a lot of small firms now doing different kinds of entrepreneurial things in software and so on, who don't go in for that kind of huge infrastructure investment. It's like comparing apples and oranges. Yeah, thank you.
There's another question that takes us in a slightly different direction. I'd be curious to hear the group's thoughts on, maybe starting again with the authors, but one of the questions was about younger voters and whether you see younger voters, especially millennials or post-millennials, having much of an impact on kind of a demand for statist policies and or attempts to combat corruption and things like that. Do you think they will have a real impact on policy or not yet?
I do see positive impact on local level local issues. The much greater engagement of this younger voters, the younger generation, than what I recall of earlier periods. So there is a beginning of the impact of demand for better services, better sort of greater transparency. You find is one finds at local level, not yet translated at national level, but still national level still is trapped with identity politics, as Devesh argued. But at local levels, one see there is a shift towards demand for better supply of governance or better supply of public goods.
Anyone else on the question of whether youth voters or younger groups are changing the direction of the polity?
So I think one of the things we are observing in the staffing of the bureaucracy is that while there are officially large number of vacancies and fewer hires, but younger people who are interested, engaged in public policy, their numbers have been expanding quite a bit. And quite a few of them are engaged in ministries at different levels, both in the national and state, as consultants. These are the people who are much more adept at using, say, IT and new technologies in a way that much of the other older parts of the government machinery are not. So they are being helpful also in complementing or augmenting weaker state capacity in ways that traditional forms of government hiring, which are very protracted, very difficult processes. So there is this a little more flexibility of staffing at the lower levels, which is helping. But as Ajay and Vijay have highlighted, this is not the case at more senior level. I just want to add one of the problems that has come with this government. It started a process called it's called 360 hires, which is that every very senior bureaucrat will have a 360-degree look at her or his record. Now, in principle, that was supposed to be about competence and integrity. Unfortunately, they are paying way too much weight on loyalty. And that means that people who are competent and have integrity, but whose loyalty test they fail. So they have just been unable to attract good talent because they are not open-minded enough.
Thanks. Ajay Chhibber.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Just wanted to say, the book is so rich, and two areas which I really liked in the book is this idea that the Indian state is trying to do too many things and ending up doing them, most of them very badly, maybe with some exceptions here and there. And then the other idea, which is very interesting in the book, is why does it do some things quite well, like send satellites to space and run elections, and and there's this very interesting analysis that was started actually by Arturo Israel at the World Bank on specificity of certain transactions and the volume of these transactions. And I think the book actually even amplifies this further into secrecy and value very well. And some of these things have also been analyzed in this book so well that haven't yet come out. Probably we haven't had enough time, but the book is really very, very rich in these issues. So I accept the point that Devesh is making about political psychology and those sorts of things. But the nuts and bolts of state administration around the world are not that different. I mean, they're obviously, every context is different, but certain tasks are done very well and certain tasks are not done well, and how to. So then when you think about it in that way, you say, well, one thing that they should do is do less, or do it less in a less complicated way. Like, why do you have to have such elaborate regulation? Why not just have simple regulation? So there are these things I just wanted to highlight as well in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. I actually want to pivot from that to I think we probably have time for one more question here, which is, there's a question asking about some of the big challenges India will face beyond kind of the growth and unemployment issues that it faces today, but issues around, can India reduce emissions? Can India pivot to clean energy? Can India incorporate AI and make progress in these areas? And this kind of goes to one of Devesh's points, which is there are areas where it may be that the state needs to intervene in some way. And so how do we think about balancing, in some senses, Ajay was just saying, there's some things the state has done very well, but it seems like it's doing too much and therefore doing many things poorly. How do you get it to focus on the things that it really seems like state intervention may be necessary? And so if a call is for less statism, how do you preserve the spots where maybe you still need some?
I'll just respond to one and then let Ajay add. I'm taking the point on your climate change challenges, which is really where state will have to take leadership, given the whole issue of two reasons. One is the externalities and second, international commitments. And here I think the story is not too bad in terms of performance on climate change and changing the energy base from fossil fuels to non-renewable, to renewable energy, but to solar energy. And there I think there is the importance of leadership, but also the importance of building consensus. Because there I think the creatively they use the process of what in India we call cooperative federalism, in which the Prime Minister and the Chief Ministers did get together and have agreed sort of national framework. So I think you're right. In some areas they're doing okay, and areas certainly solar energy they're doing much better than what I thought they'll be able to do. Maybe it's more amenable for it's much easier than many other areas. But I think, but on the many other aspects of our new challenge, our challenges, particularly for the health, for instance, there I'm afraid is not as promising as I see it. But maybe I'm wrong. But on some area of environment and climate change, I did see far better performance, and I'm trying to understand why, because I myself was surprised by this success. So maybe it's worthwhile looking at it. There are certain areas in which we can leverage that part of our state machinery. But let Ajay add to what I said.
Yeah, one of the big ideas of the book, as Ajay Chhibber was saying, was that we go all economisty on treating state capacity as a finite budget. So imagine you have a budget constraint. You've got a finite amount of resource, you've got a finite number of capable employees, you've got a finite amount of time in the day of the political leadership, and you've got to maximize within that budget constraint, and you should pick your priorities. And it seems clear that we should do fewer things. So a couple of things are inescapable. Every state in the world has to do things like a criminal justice system. Every state in the world needs resourcing, so there will need to be tax policy and tax administration. But our book is a plea that we should do less. And a community like this one should debate what are the few most important priorities that are worth pursuing. But it seems clear we should do less. We would also draw on the 19th century and 20th century European experiences where states were faced with existential threats in terms of questions of military capacity and the fiscal capacity and diplomacy. And that drove a Darwinian process where state capacity was learned in those fields. So what India faces in Ladakh is a challenge on being able to buy guns and being able to buy cold weather equipment and night vision goggles and organize an armed force to achieve state capacity. And the European story is that state capacity was first learned in the face of these existential threats. And then that knowledge, that capability, those human resource frameworks, the contracting frameworks, the financial systems were then applied to other aspects of the economy. So that could be a reasonable metaphor to describe the journey that may lie ahead of us in India.
Great, thank you so much. So we're just at the 10 o'clock hour. So I just want to sincerely thank Vijay and Ajay for sharing their book with us. It was the basis for a fantastic discussion. And thanks so much, Ashima and Devesh, for their comments. I think it kicked off a really interesting conversation about this. Thanks everyone for comments and questions in the chat. I tried to summarize some together to get most of you answered. And then also I just want to thank, as always, Ajay Chhibber for his great leadership on studying the Indian economy here at IIP. He's been a wonderful partner and I think has contributed a great deal to the discussion, and thanks to him for organizing this, but really the whole series that we've been working on there. With that, I want to remind people once again, as James mentioned, that we have a fantastic event next Wednesday on climate with David Hendry, but please in general, keep an eye out on the IIP website where you'll see more events on the Indian economy and many other interesting aspects from inequality to questions about capitalism and democracy. So please keep an eye open for these things. And James, I see you pop your video back on. Any closing words before we close this?
Just to say thank you and look forward to seeing you next month when we have another episode of Envisioning India.